In this lecture, I want to outline my research into the war on drugs that many countries waged in the 1980s and 90s, and how the war was driven by media and political factors rather than the actual size of the problem. My research examines the interaction between global media and the politics in relation to the war on drugs, and the changing global nature of media at the time. I also examined the idea that the political strategy behind the war on drugs started in America but was exported to other countries as a kind of cultural imperialism. A cultural imperialism that doesn't consume the social culture but instead takes over the political culture. A starting point for my research was to assess the relative size of drug use in different countries, to compare the political and law enforcement responses. However, the records on levels of drug use in different countries is defined by how their law enforcement agencies categorize different indicators. This makes finding comparable data almost impossible. What I did find, however, was research which clearly showed the influence that the media has on perceptions of crime. In particular, the perception of crime is more of a function of the amount of media coverage than the volume of actual crime. This result also shows that this contradiction can be seen across different countries. This phenomenon is also seen in the war on drugs, but what is interesting is that the public concern about drugs was relatively low when the war on drugs campaign started. In America, the war on drugs is most associated with Ronald Reagan, who waged his war on drugs throughout the 1980s. Interestingly, the issue of drugs hardly rated a mention in the Gallup polls in the 1970s and early 80s, but in 1987 a massive 74% of respondents in New York Times CBS News poll named drug use as the most important issue facing the country. The role of the media seems clear in creating this jump, as the research shows the number of stories about drugs massively increasing during the 1980s. The idea that governments and media interact to shape public opinion is not new, but this interaction reached a new level during the 1980s. The research showed that this was a result of the changing media landscape at the time. In America, the expansion in cable networks meant more channels with broader reach across America and the globe. The new media companies such as CNN began to emerge, and they picked up on politically driven news like the war on drugs. From the mid-1980s, this resulted in huge increases in coverage devoted to drugs, and this isn't just the impact on political opinions in America. Similar trends were seen throughout the world as these emerging media organizations expanded globally, and we start to see how the commercial model of global media mixes with the politics. These newly global media operations were driven by the commercial success of stories they were running in America, so the natural response was to run the same types of stories in other countries as well. In Australia, we experienced this through the so-called law and order auctions that formed part of the state elections throughout the 1980s and early 2000s, and even as conservative state politicians tried to reverse this trend, they faced a backlash from conservative media, who were perhaps unwilling to let go of their headlines that increased their revenues. Eventually, the moral panic driven by the media and politicians subsided, but the legacy is still with us. In many countries, that legacy is seen in the huge increases in prison populations, with a disproportionate impact on indigenous and marginalized communities. While in other countries like the Philippines, for example, we see these important political strategies playing out with devastating consequences.